Hi there, how's it going? Bonnie Violet here. In case you don't know where you are at Faith Leaders 2020. Each week I get together and I introduce you to a new faith leader. And, I'm not really good at all this, intro stuff. So I usually like to just get right in. But my guest today is the Reverend Dr. Megan Rohrer. Reverend Dr. Megan Rohrer is the first openly transgender pastor ordained in the Lutheran Church, the pastor of Grace Lutheran Church, and the Community Chaplain Coordinator for the San Francisco Police Department. Megan served for nearly a decade as a chaplain for the homeless and hungry in San Francisco, and Megan was the finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, received an honorable mention as an Unsung Hero of Compassion by Wisdom in Action with His Holiness the Dali Lama, and was also featured on season 5 of Netflix Queer Eye. And I added another, we're doing Instagram as well, so it's a little bit newer thing for me. There we go. And here's Megan.
We did it.
We did. It does look like it muted you. Like you're muted on the.
How about
there we
now?
go. All right. Woohoo. Here we go. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Absolutely. I'm glad to be here.
Likewise. Do you have an echo?
I have a slight echo, yes.
Is it on the...
It might be our Instagram live
there we
foiling
go.
us.
I think I'm good now.
Yay.
Yeah, great. Awesome. All right. Well, looks like Aaron's joined us already. Aaron is a regular, so I just want to say hello to Aaron right quick. Hi, Aaron. So glad you could join us today. All right. So now that we get all the mechanics, I guess, put together, huh?
The hardest thing you get the behind the scenes of why it's hard to be a pastor these days, right?
Right. Totally.
So many devices.
I know. And since Instagram doesn't play well with others, we got to kind of, play around with it a little bit. All right. So I like to just get right in here. I'm always get a little curious about learning a little bit about people and kind of like what their childhood was like, and maybe how spirituality or religion might have been a part of that. So if you want to start there, that would be great.
Sure. I grew up in South Dakota.
All right.
I'm sure what everyone says as their answer on your show, right?
Oh, yeah, everyone.
Everyone. In South Dakota, being Lutheran, which is where I'm a pastor, is kind of like, for some people, what it's like to be Jewish in New York. It's a culture and it's a religion. And so being Lutheran was kind of a part of the ethos in the world around me. And we also chose to go to Lutheran Church as a part of our family. But it was very homogenous and very straight-laced. And it was very late in my kind of just forming into adulthood that I knew that gay people existed at all, or that trans people existed. I really just believed that like what you saw in an after-school special was what it was like to be every human on the planet. Right. So white, straight lens was really what I saw in the world.
Right. You're echoing a little bit. Can you try your volume? Is your volume on your phone or your computer?
Let's see what I can do. Hold on.
Yes, it's turned. There we go. Is that better?
It's better on my end, but I'm not sure about you.
I think it's better. The folks on Instagram will tell us.
Yes, they will.
Awesome. So being Lutheran is something you've been your entire life?
Yeah. I went to a Lutheran college. I bet you didn't even know that was a thing, but there are lots of Lutheran colleges out in the Midwest. Then when I was 21, I moved to Berkeley, and there I went to Lutheran Seminary, which is baby pastor school. And then I moved to San Francisco a little while after that, and here I still am.
Yeah. Did you, I guess it seems like our Instagram is still getting feedback somehow. I don't know if I don't know if we need to just like give up
quit and try over. It was a valiant effort that we tried.
I know, right? Maybe what we can do is just, folks, if you are on Instagram and you'd like to join us, you can go to A Queer Chaplain on Facebook or YouTube. Also, you can go to Reverend Dr Megan Rohrer's Facebook page, and you should be able to find us live there as well. We apologize that we're having these technical issues, but it's 2020. We know how this goes.
We tried.
All right, so we'll go ahead and say goodbye on the Instagram.
Bye, Instagram. Well, hopefully that fixes everything. I think it is.
Yeah. Woohoo. Okay, good. There we go. All right. Hopefully we didn't lose.
We bit off more than we can chew, which is fine. We're just plugging forward. Well, it's so my family in South Dakota are depression survivors. So they lived kind of through the Great Dust Bowl. They well, even before that, they immigrated to the United States from Norway and from Germany and from Switzerland, and like lived in barns until they could raise enough money as farmhands to be able to have their own farms in South Dakota. And so I come from pretty rugged stock, and folk who have known economic hardship. And so like when my ancestors way back in the 1700s or late 1700s moved to the United States, they were doing it because of Great Depressions in Norway and in other countries. And so there's a long history of people in my genealogy who have been rugged through economic downturns and who have like found creative ways to live through it. And that's things that are kind of hip now, like called homesteading things, like canning and pie making and growing your own plants in creative urban farming kinds of ways. Right. And I think those influences helped me kind of have that queer spirit of enduring kind of whatever environment you end up in. If you get a low-paying job, you make it more fabulous because you can like make use of things that are around you. And so I kind of have used that rugged spirit to spend a lot of my time as a pastor caring for the poor and caring for the homeless, but also to do things in really creative ways. And so like we have a lot of murals around our congregation that are made from cardboard and magazines. And we did a large gardening project where we took the burnt out hole where a church used to be, and we transformed it using trash from the dump here in San Francisco and made a giant free farm that gave away like 4 tons of produce to people who were in the neighborhood and helping. And so I think that's a part of the flavor of what I take from kind of my genealogy being rooted in South Dakota, and it's kind of blessed me with the ability to work hard physically. Like if someone's like, you're going to have to dig a lot with shovels, I'm like, okay, let's shovel. Instead of kind of being deterred. And so I think so often in queer narratives, people begin with like the place where they lived that wasn't as welcoming for their LGBTQ identity or their transness. And so I'm trying to talk about the spaces that maybe were difficult in my life with that same kind of erring on the side of loveliness that I would like people to err on the side of loveliness with me. And so like, yeah, there were difficult parts of being or feeling like you're the only one in an entire state that is like you. But there's also these wonderfully beautiful skills that I learned kind of in the midst of that made me more resilient and maybe, I don't know, queerer than I would have been if I didn't come from that space.
Yeah, I totally get that. I'm from small town place. I feel like I'm not much like most of the people around there, but the way that I was raised and the things that I was taught by my family, most of them are really helpful. And I think they're things that have caused me to in some interesting way, hold my queerness and my transness a little bit better, even though they might not know what to do with it, you know?
Yeah. And there was also this kind of, even when in South Dakota, they would debate things like in the Lutheran Church, there was a 20-year period in time where they were like, gay people, we don't know. And that's a nice way of putting kind of what that conversation was, because it began at the beginning of the AIDS crisis, right? And so debating people's worth and dignity in the midst of an overwhelming, deadly disease, sinful timing. And I don't use the word sinful very often, but that was sinful timing to be doing it during the AIDS crisis. But there was this time period when Lutherans were like, oh, should gay people be allowed to be pastors? We don't know. And people in South Dakota would go to these big open debates and they would say, well, we don't think gay people should be pastors because we heard all these stereotypes about them. But Megan will be a wonderful pastor. Like that was a part of their speeches. And so I just always had this weird way of being like embraced and held, but it also like was made known that if others were like me, it wouldn't be okay. And that's never an okay message to hear.
Right.
So it was a strange way to kind of navigate the 90s and the post Matthew Shepard world, maybe would be the way to put it.
Did you ever have a time where you thought maybe you couldn't exist fully within the Lutheran faith?
Yeah, I had always been told by people that they thought I would be a pastor, and I kind of thought that was not the best career choice, because at the time when the Lutheran Church was trying to figure out whether or not gay people had dignity, it made me wonder about them, because at every baptism I had ever been to, at every ordination I had been to, like the through line of Lutheran theology is that God saved you so well that you can never screw it up, right? That's why it's the fact that God saved you. It can be proven because you're just a human. You can't screw up God's saving of you. And that's like the baseline of all Lutheranism. And so to debate specific people, or to try to ask a minority group to convince a majority that they have value and dignity, anytime that conversation starts with, well, prove it, makes no sense in a faith context, right? We're people who act on faith, not on, well, prove it. And so I still held my beliefs really strongly. I felt like I had a really great relationship with God, but I just kind of was like, it felt like such obvious hypocrisy that it didn't feel like it was Lutheran to me. And so that's part of what gave me a step back. But when I was in college, the campus pastor was on the candidacy committee. That's the fancy word for the people who get to decide who's a pastor or not as you go through different stages of education. And the South Dakota Synod at the time had made a decision for a straight white male that said, after he had done something that really truly was all the things erroneously feared about gay people, and they had said that this person could be a pastor. And the campus pastor at the college was so mad about that she said, you got to apply right now. Please apply right now, because you are such a strong pastor for ministry. They've just done this super hypocritical thing where they let someone in and there's no way after all this that they can say no based on your sexuality. And so I applied right then. And at first, kind of the Lutheran Church in South Dakota was like, yeah, we like you, you're great. that, I was kind of like, it's kind of like if you're a super gay, like if you're the
Right.
shining star, the knight of everyone, you can kind of forge your own path. And so I did that.
Well, I think sometimes.
But then they wanted me to lie about being gay. And so they were going to secretly support me, but wanted me to lie about being gay. And I knew that that candidacy committee could never be punished. If they would have said yes to me, fully as I was, they could never be punished. But if I lied, then I could be put on trial for having lied to the church. And so I just thought, if you're going to do something to step out on a limb, it shouldn't put me in jeopardy later. And so I chose not to lie.
Right. And you were able to just kind of keep going through?
No, well, so I got ordained using an old-timey writing by Martin Luther called the Smalcald Articles. So Luther, in his day, part of the Reformation was about this idea that if you force people to be celibate who are not called to it, it leads to bad and dangerous things for cities and towns. Like there were fathers who had secret families, all the stuff that is problematic when people are not called to celibacy was happening back then as it's happening now. And so Martin Luther wrote something called the Smalcald Articles. It said, when bishops say you have to be celibate in order to be a pastor, break their rules and follow these steps. And so there was a group called Extraordinary Lutheran Ministries who followed that ancient article about what you do, because if the Lutheran Church at that time didn't say gay people couldn't be pastors, they said you had to be celibate. And so there were about 18 pastors in total that defied the Lutheran Church's policy. We got ordained anyway, following the older set of rules, and we were deemed extraordinary pastors. So outside of the ordinary church, extraordinary, right? Super pastors. Right. And then in 2009, when the Lutheran Church changed their policy, they finally figured it out that gay people are awesome and it adds to the life of a church. We had to go through a actual church ceremony to become ordinary.
Oh, wow.
If you ask me, I don't know if it worked, but I will try to work on being more ordinary. Yeah. Every day.
That's so interesting. Was there, when you were extraordinary, could you act, like, were there certain things you could or couldn't do? Like, what made it different?
So we were recognized as pastors of the congregations that had called us. But the Lutheran Church invented something called the official roster of pastors. It didn't exist prior to this. They don't call it the official roster anymore, but there is a roster of pastors. So they had all of the churches change their constitutions in the Lutheran Church to say you can only hire a pastor from the official roster of pastors.
So then if you were extraordinary, you weren't on that official roster?
Yeah, so I wasn't on the official roster, which meant every year when the Lutherans assemble in their small groups to vote on issues of the church, I wasn't allowed to vote in the Lutheran Church because I wasn't on the official roster. And often they wouldn't even put the word Reverend on my name tag. So we would have to write in that we were pastors on our name tags. Yeah. One year we got scarlet red name tags to show that we were not visitors, but not pastors. Scarlet red, it made me laugh.
Right. Well, how was that for you? I guess part of me is like, why did you stay?
I think part of it is that I was at the time called to serve the homeless and hungry in San Francisco. So I was working on Polk Street with folk who were homeless 12 plus years, who had moved to San Francisco because they were LGBTQ and then couldn't economically afford to live there, or their addiction, which they gained as a part of their admittance into the queer community, or they were loved and claimed until they were no longer sexually desirable due to whatever changes, mostly through HIV and AIDS. And so there was this group of discarded folk who lived in San Francisco, and I felt really deeply in my soul that I was privileged and lucky that I had grown up in South Dakota and my family loved and supported me, that I had a professional job, that I was able to kind of achieve my goals. But there was a group of people who believed they would rather live homeless in San Francisco than with the communities where they came from, often those same Midwestern places or Southern spaces, wherever it was that they believed their churches or their family couldn't love and support them. And so when compared to the amount of crap that homeless people deal with on an everyday basis, it honestly didn't feel as tough. Like if the worst thing that happens in my life is someone doesn't put the word Reverend on my name tag,
Right.
I'm still better off than my Black trans child, right? In terms of power and privilege. And so I think honestly, it was like, I think my whole life has been something where if I just get through the obstacle that's in front of me, then I'm good to go. And if I look back, I'm like, holy crap, I've like been through a lot. If I would have known this, would I have like kept doing this? And I think maybe it's that rugged stock that I come from. Maybe it's this idea that as depression people, we have to kind of always be readjusting and making do. But I just think I didn't ever see it as the whole world against me, because I had always had these experiences like in South Dakota of people saying, oh, we love you, just not this. And so I always found the yes inside the no, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So it wasn't, you didn't feel necessarily oppressed by it. You just kind of felt like you wanted to challenge it, or?
Well, I mean, I think there's definitely like days where you can't do anything but cry. I just didn't ever live in that space, right? I always had to get up each day and feed the homeless lunch. And so if I didn't get up each day, there wasn't lunch. And so there's just something about the work that I've been doing in an outward way that's felt like it's really driven me. And that's, as now I'm the pastor of Grace Lutheran in San Francisco, the sleepy kind of Sunset District where there's lots of fog. And it feels the same. It's not the same day-to-day emergency to feed people, but I get messages every week, maybe hundreds every month, that are people who really will say things like, I chose not to die today because you exist. Like, it gives me hope that you're in the world. And there are people who check in every week after the service and they say, like, I made it through this week. Like, let's make it through next week. And I just think there are so many people who are reaching out and who are connecting, who don't have that same hope or don't have the same ability to find the yes inside of when the world has kind of fallen to crap, that I feel like, I don't know if it's an obligation, but I just feel a kinship with all the queer people who are living in parts of the world where they might be able to physically get communion nearby, but they can't get good news near them. And so, so that's who I try to reach out to and who connects with our congregation. We've had people fly in from as far as Australia just to come to a church service led by a trans person. And so I feel this responsibility to other people that's bigger than me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's powerful. And Angel says, he quoted, I always found the yes inside. I want to say hello to Angel as well as Bob Kaiser. They're both are appreciating that you're here, sharing your story with us.
Yeah.
So in relation to, so it seemed like, like the Lutheran Church, if you will, maybe had issues with your sexuality and how it related to you being ordained or a reverend. How was your relationship with God? Was that different?
Yeah, so when I was 6, my parents got divorced in a pretty dramatic way. My father was an alcoholic, and so it was a very kind of messy split. And I just remember having this very mystical connection with God and feeling like, even though I was only 6 years old, like I knew everything was going to be okay in a really kind of intense internal kinds of way. And so like, I feel like I've never had a moment where I doubted whether God was with me or rooting for me. And that I think is not everyone's pathway, but I think it needed to be my pathway if I was going to kind of trudge through the muck and the mire of the way kind of my journey has gone. And that what that means is that, you know, like in my chaplaincy work with first responders, I can get called out to some really unique, terrible tragedies that if, you know, for some people, if you peek inside a deep, deep trauma, you kind of lose your hope for the world. And I can dip into those spaces and know that God is with me and that God's going to be on the other side of what terrible thing just happened. And so I am not a saint. I don't feel like my faith is perfect. I definitely say the wrong thing from every time or two. But the other thing that's been really important is that I've lived long enough to see every single person who bullied or doubted me apologize. Right? Save for that bishop in South Dakota, and I'm sure her letter is coming. But like the Lutheran Church, when I was on Queer Eye, sent out a tweet saying how proud they were of me and of those on the show, right? Never in a million years when I was on the separate roster did I think the National Lutheran Church in the United States would send out a tweet saying they were proud of me. And so there is something that comes from just knowing that constancy, right? Following the same ethic, continuing to be fabulous, like it wears people out. And I think even harder for me than knowing that God is with me is trusting in those like crying so hard the snot is ugly kind of space, is remembering that those who are shouting you down will be apologizing in a few more years if you just stay constant.
Right. Yeah. I'm curious, could you explain a little bit kind of like what a chaplain does, say in relation to the police department?
Yeah. So chaplains are the term used for someone who is providing spiritual care kind of outside of a traditional churchy space. And chaplains, because we have a constitution in the United States that says we don't favor one religion over another, chaplains are constitutional chaplains, which means that if I am somewhere in my role as a chaplain, my goal is to amplify their faith and remind them of the communities of faith they might be connected to or the resources that come from their own faith that will help them through whatever difficult situation they're in. And what I'm not ever doing is inviting someone to church or trying to teach them creeds or any of the stuff that people might imagine pastors do or that terrible pastors did do back in the day. And so there are chaplains in hospitals who care for people. There are chaplains in the military that care for people. Anywhere where death is something that could occur unexpectedly or regularly, there are typically chaplains, both to help people be at ease with their own death, and also for the faith communities where having certain rituals at the time of your death is important, to have a chaplain nearby to be able to do those rites and rituals. And for law enforcement chaplains, it can mean two things. It can mean caring for the officers and the people who are employees of the police department. It means public prayers at graduation, like non-denominational ones that kind of encapsulate the whole city that you are a part of. It could be prayers at memorial services for people who have been lost. It could be funerals. I've done weddings, and it can also sometimes be things like baptisms. I try to go to a lot of bouncy house parties. I try to be there when people are celebrating and having fun, they don't just think of the chaplain as the person who shows up when
somebody's
bad
going to die. Right.
As a community chaplain for law enforcement, when there is a 911 call that is primarily about grief or something of a spiritual nature, or where sitting with a person of faith might be helpful for what's happening. It means that the dispatchers can call on non-denominational chaplains to go and be with people. So if there's a tragic death or a mass tragic something, I can go and be with those communities, be with the community members, just because being with community members is important in their time of need,
Right.
but then also to check in on the first responders before, during, and after whatever happened, because if they called for a chaplain, it's probably something pretty heavy.
Right. And so you're one of many, is that? Yeah.
Yeah, so we have 8 sworn police chaplains at the San Francisco Police Department. They've gone back to forever. They used to back in the like 1700s, they had informal folk who just were people of faith who were nearby, and some who like would run into buildings and free people from like slavery and things like way back in the day, like with axes. We don't do that. But
not anymore.
no chaplains with axes. It's not a good idea.
Right. I'm curious with, like 2020, there's like, there's been a lot of like just coming to light even more about police brutality. So how has it been being a person of faith, as well as part of the police department, and then also as part of this, the police brutality has unfortunately, it's always been there, and we've had moments of like seeing it and then it going away. But for now, it seems like it got bigger than it ever has. How was that for you, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I mean, so I've studied kind of some of the history around policing in San Francisco, in part because I was helping the chief with an apology about policing towards LGBTQ folk in San Francisco. And so I'm not an expert in how policing laws work or the tools that they use, but it has seemed like a number of times when community ideas about how policing should work rise up, like how should protesters be treated was a really big issue that came up in the 60s and 70s over and over and over again. So those conversations come up. How can we do better about caring for all people, caring for all communities? Those conversations come up over and over again. I guess one of the things that is unique about the San Francisco Police Department is that over 50% of the police department here is people of color. And there's a pretty large group of LGBTQ police officers. And so for me, that matters. Like, as someone who grew up in South Dakota, where having embodied people matters. Right. I think the steady stream of helping people get better is always what all of us should be doing. And certainly as someone who has Black children, I care very much about how those conversations kind of progress into the world. It's hard for me to really know, because there's actual studies that say when a chaplain is around police officers, they actually will act in a way where they are thinking about how their actions are perceived, even at a higher rate than having a body-worn camera, right? Yeah. But there's something about having a person who is
like God is watching.
Yeah, like an ethical and moral statue. So I couldn't really comment on what's going on, because anytime I enter the room probably changes.
Gotcha.
But I think what I am appreciative of is people who are continuously striving to like make the world better, and people who are continuously participating in ways that they can get their voice heard. And so one of the cool things that I get to do in my role as a chaplain is I get to help nonviolent protests remain nonviolent when community members are interested in a chaplain. And so what that has meant is that I get to go to all the protests in my role as a chaplain for the police department. And so I get to kind of hear everything that's coming in, and I also get to be on a bullhorn every once in a while. And so I haven't really felt like I'm in the middle, but I'm kind of helping to amplify the conversation however it ends up. I do, as any chaplain would, I always think about how at the end of this conversation can I still be a chaplain for everyone, right? So how can I be a chaplain for those who are going through a large amount of grief?
Right.
And how can I be a chaplain for the police department who called me? And so I might not say every opinion I have every single day of the week, but I imagine most jobs are like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's really interesting because you kind of talk about being in these spaces. I guess that could kind of be, I feel like some people might feel conflicted to be in. And yet I think you're aware of that, but you're also like, that's just kind of, like, that's just kind of the way that things are, which I think is quite remarkable.
Well, part of that comes from how I was invited to be a chaplain for the police department, which is that an LGBTQ officer said, if I die, I want to know that my family will be treated well at my funeral, right? And not because any of the other chaplains held beliefs that wouldn't be the case, but they wanted there to be a queer chaplain at the police department so they would know 100% for sure if they died that their family would be treated well at their funeral. And so that conversation always centers me, because in moments where, it might make you wonder what kind of job you have on a stressful day. I just think like the LGBTQ officers are amazing and they deserve a chaplain who's like them. And here I am, like, let's figure this out. And for me, it says something that I was chosen to be a chaplain, right? Like a trans person was allowed to like put on a uniform and pray at events. And that my showing up helps change the look and the feel and the sound of what diversity is. And so, I don't know, everything's hard sometimes, but but it's real hard to not show up when people want you to be at their funeral.
Right. Yeah. No, that's powerful. And I think the reason why maybe I asked that too is because, like, for me now, like, because I do feel like I have a strong sense of like my relationship with, sometimes I call it God, whatever, like my spiritual life kind of helps me and causes me to be in those spaces with the idea that there's not really a side, like to be on, and how do you kind of help both sides move forward. So, because I think for me, there were times when I had less faith and less connection with God and then I get caught up in how the world would want me to react and respond to what's happening. So, yes.
There's something about like literally walking a mile in someone's shoes that changes your perspective. And so, there were, for the not this last year because the Pride March was virtual, but for the previous 2 years, I wore a police uniform and walked with the LGBT officers in the Pride Parade in San Francisco. And so just to be able to support people, like, it's not my uniform. It's not like, a lot of it is not what I am familiar with, but you really become someone's pastor or their chaplain in a different way when you're willing to walk with them through something that's hard.
Yeah. Well, and representation is so powerful. I know for me, like, and in a lot of the conversations that I've had, people maybe like they started in a church and they didn't see women in leadership, or maybe like for me, I was, and this is kind of embarrassing to think of, but I guess I only saw the Bible with white people. Like, and I think part of that was just, again, my lens, I was like, I see the world through my eyes. And there's definitely been a lot more of like, oh, I see trans people, I see people of color, I don't even know if there are any white people in the Bible. Not right.
There's a moment when Jesus is transfigured on top of a mountain where everyone turns white, but it's just a moment and then they go back down the hill, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So how has, I know 2020 has also, in COVID, shelter in place, how has it impacted spiritual care and how you do church, and how have you kind of addressed some of those things?
I think at the beginning of sheltering in place last March, I think one of the new things that people were trying to figure out was, how can we be chaplains or pastors when we're in the crisis too? Like normally we would call in someone who's outside of the crisis to come care for people inside of the crisis. And this is something that was worldwide and there was no one outside of the crisis. So I think for a lot of people, they had to readjust what it meant to be a pastor in those moments.
Yeah.
For me, it was really helpful to have been to a lot of emergencies, a lot of deep disasters, because I kind of knew how my body was going to be different. I knew, like, start drinking bubbly water now, or your tummy's going to hurt a lot. Like, so I kind of knew some of the patterns of what stress and trauma looks like over a long period of time in my own body.
Right.
And so I was really grateful for that. What I wasn't prepared for is, like, how exhausting it could be to physically have to, like, change your church location like every week, because every week it feels like a different public health order comes out, and then when that happens, like, we literally would have to rearrange the entire sanctuary in order to do what was the safest that week. Or there was several months where we would do worship outside, and so then you need different microphones to do worship outside and live stream than for inside and live stream, and measuring how far all the chairs are and what kind of communion packets you're going to have for each thing. And so it's, for me, it's been the logistical stuff that you normally don't have to worry about because the chairs are screwed down, became a lot more exhausting for me, just because it felt like the prayers you can do online, the worship you can do online, but the literal fear that came with, if these chairs are too close together, church could kill you, was, that for me was incredibly exhausting, and having to read just like reams of legal paperwork. And I did 2 different weddings so far during this shelter in place time. And so, like, I've delighted in the ways that you can, like, have the couple on a porch, and then I'm in the middle of the yard, and then the people at the wedding are on the side. Like, I really thrive in that kind of creativity. But man, it's exhausting to feel like, what if this wedding isn't real? Because now even all of the wedding paperwork is different, and where you turn it in is different, and how you turn it in is only during these hours in this tiny box. And so there were a lot of, like, logistical stuff that has really added to everything COVID. And, like, I would say in the beginning too, it was hard. I have a 7 and an 8-year-old, and I have a wife in the other room who's working full time at a law office, right? And balancing, like, live streams, most of what I need to record needs quiet backgrounds, and, like, or if your kids are behaving badly and you're a pastor, you can't, like, discipline in the way, like, I overthink everything. Like, if I tell my kid to go to their room and be quiet, is it going to ruin someone's faith? And so it just really has transformed the way I, like, think about most things.
Right.
For sure.
Nice. I just want to say hello to Stacy and Chris and Don. Welcome as well. Have you noticed like more people needing spiritual care, less sort of spiritual care? Are there issues or questions that people are having that are different? Or
well, the other thing that happened during shelter in place is, like, Queer Eye Season 5 came out, and that really was like everyone in the world's going to email you over this month, right? And so I think the number one question I get from people online is, how can I learn to pray? Which is surprising to a lot of people. I mean, there's a lot of, like, thank yous, and that was great, and it helped me. But, like, the number one solid thing that people want pastoral care for is, like, prayer. Or, like, I haven't had a relationship with God in years, but I would like to start one now. How do I start? And just giving people permission to do the parts that are easy, and then adding other bits later, and not doing what isn't working right now, and knowing that it'll change, because this whole pandemic changes everything every week or so as it reshuffles the deck. And so it's been really lovely, because I feel like during this time of pandemic, people have asked the kinds of questions that I always like imagined pastors spent their time doing. Like, I imagine pastors were like, let's talk about what Martin Luther said, or like, let's do Bible study. And in non-pandemic times, I love my congregation, but we spent a lot of time talking about who was recycling the trash properly and who wasn't. Right.
Yeah.
So all those building logistic issues are not as big of issues. And now we're talking about like Bible study and what hymns we like. And so I just think it's been a really lovely way to get people back to wanting to have faithful rhythms and conversations that are more churchy than before.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's really caused a lot of people to really think about what is important and what is going on in their life, whether they're kind of like pushed to the nth degree because they're having to do so much more right now.
Yeah.
Or if I think some folks also are like, I don't have anything to do anymore, or I'm doing everything in my life in this like little, like for me, in this little room.
Yeah.
And it's an adjustment. And when you're just stuck with yourself, all right, God, like, what's up?
Yeah. And I've really leaned into the idea that with all of the trauma that people are experiencing, with all of the stress that people have, with all the ways their chemicals are out of whack, that like the more I can just give them joy and hope without any work, like you don't have to open your hymnals, you don't have to know anything about the Bible. I'm going to explain it to you in the amount of time that you have and in the amount of like brain resource you have right now. And that's where I think a lot of my chaplaincy work has really helped it, because it has like, now I post a picture every single day where I just say something nice, right? Every Friday I'll just say, we made it through another week. And I swear to you that Friday post is the most loved of all of my posts, because people are like, oh, I did make it through another week. I hadn't known it. Like, hooray. And so I think being willing to be a cheerleader, I mean, everybody knows how awful it is. They don't need more people to tell them how awful everything is.
Right.
But to be someone who they can always look to find something hopeful, or that unique spin on it, or the yes in the midst of everything that's kind of crappy.
Right.
I think that's what people are kind of
looking for, seeking.
Yeah, dehydrated for.
Yeah. Lisa is sending love from Lower Alabama to Lisa's favorite quarantine pastor. Thank you for filling the void.
Welcome.
Yes.
It's such a wonderful time to be seeking. If you are someone who doesn't know how you want to root your faith, if you don't know what kind of churches you like, if you don't know what kind of pastors you like, if you don't know what kind of hymns you like, this is such a beautiful time to be seeking, because you can literally go on a church's live stream, and then if it's terrible, leave and no one looks at you, right? Yep. You used to have to go sit through the whole service, even if it wasn't terrible, just for the fear of walking out partway through.
Right,
and
right.
you just click through them, take in what you need, and you don't even have to apologize for not liking something, because literally so much content is in your midst, right?
Yeah, yeah. I have that problem of on Sunday morning, I have my notifications are going off like crazy.
Yeah.
I have 5 or 6 different church services that I like. And so I pop into one. I'm like, I'm not feeling this one this week. I'm going to go to Milwaukee, or I'm going to go to Chicago, or it's definitely a really interesting time. And because of that, I've been able to, I think, hear more perspectives, more points of views. You have churches who are, out there protesting with Black Lives Matters, and you have other churches that aren't. You have churches that are trying to meet anyway in person because that's really important to them, and others that are like, nope, until everyone can come to church, we're not going to have church.
Yeah. And for the people for whom they had ways in which it was painful for their body or chronic pain, and so they couldn't get out of their house, or people who have anxiety issues, and being in a community is too hard for them. just the number of churches that are able to do things online has just made our accessibility go from here to here. And I just think it's so wonderful that, you know, a lot of us are streaming on places where there's automatic closed captioning now, which is something we never did, right? And so I just love the way that what we've done out of necessity has made it so that more people can have access to our spaces. And maybe I hope at least that will encourage us to like get the ramps we need and get the closed captioning that happens live in services that'll help us like up our game. Because my call has really been for our building to say, our building is closed for a period of time, but when we reopen it, we're going to reopen more diverse than when we close. We're going to reopen more racially diverse, more diverse in every way.
Yeah. Well, and I think, and so like for folks who are listening who maybe come across here and maybe you haven't seen people in church like yourself, now is a really great time to kind of see that. I know that's been really quite remarkable for me. Kind of like you were talking about earlier, representation or being seen in different spaces is really powerful. So I don't know.
At the beginning of Shelter in Place, we intentionally recorded from our living room so that people could see my wife and my children. Because it's one thing to know that I'm a trans pastor or that I have a queer family, but if what you normally saw on the live stream was just like me at a pulpit, you don't get the opportunity to see like, this is what lesbians look like in their living room, or like whatever the identifier is that feels different. And so I loved the idea of being queer church where some people for the first time would be seeing our home life.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a part of that showing them that you're in this with them. You know, I think sometimes there can be like this detachment maybe, or this, and so I think it does kind of show like, hey, I'm in this with you.
Yeah. Like if my house, if I can add, you know, here's what it looks like to make an altar. And here's like, I've brought home parts of the things you would see in a church. Like people might recognize that I've got like way too many candles than one person should have, but bringing just enough of the churchy stuff that it feels the same level of sacred, but more like they worshiped in Jesus's day in little houses, in their own houses. Like the Last Supper was just in a room in somebody's house.
Right. Well, and church is beyond just the building, right?
Absolutely.
I also wanted to acknowledge, hi, Dick. Hi, Dawn. Hi, Miriam. Thanks for popping in today. We are like right at our like hour mark. So we are in the holiday season. For many folks, we're celebrating different holidays. For some people, it's a really exciting time. Even though it's normally exciting, this year is different. And I want to acknowledge that for some people, this is a really difficult time anyway. So what, I guess, as we go, is there anything that you would like to say to folks that they could kind of keep in mind over the remainder of the year and into 2021?
Yeah. Well, I really want people to remember that your faith isn't just in your brain. It's not just in your heart. It's not just wherever you imagine your soul to be. So for people who went to buildings to find sacred touch points in the world, those sacred places were trying to care for all of your senses, right? There were smells that were trying to make you wonder what God smells like.
Right.
There were sounds that would reverberate and echo to try to make you have an imagination about what God sounds like, right? There might have been things that you could touch, and soft fabrics or railings. And so as you are caring for your faith at home or in whatever places that you gather, think about all of those senses, right? Maybe it's a candle that makes you think about God. Maybe it's an infuser with essences. This time of year, I've got literally frankincense and myrrh essence oils that will come up when I'm doing church, right? Because it just feels a little more churchier to me. And so if twinkle lights are what's doing it for you, do twinkle lights. If poetry is what what is doing it for you, like that's cool. If it's going out into nature and listening to birds, then you and St. Francis have a lot in common.
Right,
And
right.
so think about if you're real good in one area, if you're really good at imagery connecting you with the sacred, think about ways that you can add at least one more of the senses into your faithful life, because otherwise we just get resumed to like thinking brains inside of these tiny little boxes, and God is so much bigger than all of that. And it also can help you if you get angry when a person of faith says the wrong word or the wrong gender or the wrong theology. In a church space, you used to be able to zone out and like look at the windows that were really pretty, or look at the artwork that was really pretty, or just think about the smell. So you need good ways to like tune out when the pastor's sermon is boring.
Right. Yeah. Yes. Thank you for all of that. That idea of just leaning into the something more is really fantastic. I know. I think the biggest challenge for me has been touch, because I live with people, but we're social distanced. So touch is not something that happens. So it's like really cheesy, but I've started like I have a stuffed animal now that that I hold, and that helps me feel touch and connection. So I guess that's might be what I would encourage some people to think about. If you don't have the animals, you don't have the people, maybe even a pillow. I just think touch is such a powerful thing right now that I took for granted, definitely.
Yeah, there's a really good like mantra in the trauma care world, where it's when you're in the shower, you just touch a different part of your body and you say, "This is my body, it's big enough for me." And then you touch another part and you say, "This is my body, it's big enough for me." And you go through whatever number of body parts that you feel comfortable with, but it's just a way of like acknowledging that all of you is there.
Yeah.
And that you're enough, right? You don't have to say like, "This is my body and it's beautiful."
Right.
It's not all there right now, but like, this is my body and it's big enough for me. And it's just a way of coming back to yourself.
Great. Yeah. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking the time to be on the show today. For folks that are coming across this stream, this is part of a podcast, so it will live on a podcast along with the other faith leaders that I've spoken to over the last few weeks. You can search for A Queer Chaplain anywhere you listen to podcasts, as well as you can find the videos on YouTube, as well as Instagram, all at A Queer Chaplain. And then next week will be our final week, because 2020 is almost over.
We did it.
Yes. And so you might have noticed that we had somebody different scheduled for this week. James Powell is actually in Canada, and Canada is about to go into a more tight lockdown as well. And so he's doing his Christmas today, because tomorrow everything gets shut down a little bit more. So we will be having James Powell next Wednesday at 3:33 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. And he has a podcast called This Little Light of Mine, which is really fantastic. If you get a chance, check it out. He shares about his experience being gay and growing up in a fundamentalist kind of Christian environment, and how he's kind of addressed to spiritual trauma and drama and all that sort of fun stuff. But it's a really great podcast if you all want to check it out. So thanks again, Megan. Thanks everyone who joined us today, and take care. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
And I have an outro that I almost forgot about. Here we
Best
go.
outro ever.
Right? Cool.